His world crumbled. The dusty pulpit, once his fortress, now felt like a cage. The preacher spoke of God's justice, but when Wakan Tanka appeared, his faith was never the same. A whisper from the wilderness, a tremor in his soul, shattered the very bedrock of his certainty. He stood at the precipice of a truth far grander, far more terrifying than any sermon. Witness the unraveling. Subscribe. The preacher stood tall, a beacon of unwavering conviction against the vast, indifferent canvas of the old west sky. His voice, a resonant instrument of divine decree, echoed through the rough-hewn chapel, each word a hammer blow, forging the iron of God's justice into the hearts of his flock. He spoke of righteousness and retribution, of a world neatly divided into light and shadow, where every deed found its just and swift recompense under the watchful eye of a singular, omnipotent deity. His faith was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute, built brick by brick from scripture and unwavering certainty. He saw the world through a lens of divine order, a grand design where every suffering had purpose, every triumph a blessing. The dusty plains, the rugged mountains, the very air that carried the scent of sagebrush and distant thunder, all were testament to a celestial blueprint he believed he understood intimately. His congregation, a motley collection of settlers, prospectors, and weary travelers, hung on his every syllable, finding solace in the rigid structure he offered against the chaotic freedom of the frontier. He was their shepherd, guiding them through the moral wilderness with a shepherd's crook of unshakable truth. His sermons were not merely words, they were pronouncements, declarations of an immutable law that governed the heavens and the earth. He preached of a God who saw all, judged all, and whose scales of justice were perfectly balanced, tipping only to mete out what was deserved. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible pride in his posture, in the way his gaze swept over the faces before him, a silent affirmation of his own privileged understanding of the divine will. He was the vessel, the voice, the very embodiment of that unyielding truth in a land that often seemed to defy all order. Yet beyond the confines of his chapel, beyond the familiar faces of his flock, lay a world he had yet to truly comprehend. The wind carried ancient whispers he dismissed as mere superstition. The land held secrets he attributed to the untamed wildness of nature, not to any deeper, sentient force. His understanding was a meticulously crafted box, beautiful in its precision, but ultimately limited by its own perfect design. He believed he held the key to all spiritual mysteries, never suspecting that the lock itself might be an illusion. His conviction was a shield, deflecting any stray thought that might challenge the edifice of his belief. He had seen hardship, yes, and injustice, but he always found a way to fit it into the grand narrative of God's inscrutable plan, a test of faith, a path to greater glory. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for the unknown to intrude upon the sacred geometry of his theology. He was a man of answers, not questions, and his answers were always, unequivocally, divine. He walked among them, a figure of spiritual authority, his shadow long and straight in the afternoon sun, a testament to the uprightness of his soul. He was the rock, the foundation, the unwavering point in a shifting landscape. He believed he knew God, knew his will, knew his justice. He believed he knew everything. He believed he knew everything, but the desert held secrets his sermons could never touch. The preacher often ventured beyond the nascent settlement, drawn by a sense of duty to minister to the scattered homesteads and lonely outposts, but also by a quiet, almost unconscious pull towards the vast, untamed expanse. He would ride for hours, the rhythmic thud of hooves against the dry earth a counterpoint to the silent hymns he hummed. He saw the grandeur of creation in the towering mesas and the endless sky, yet his gaze remained fixed on the familiar, interpreting every vista through the lens of his established faith, a testament to the singular glory of his God. He sometimes encountered the indigenous people, their camps nestled in hidden valleys, their figures moving with a grace that seemed born of the land itself. He would offer them his scriptures, his words of salvation, seeing them as lost souls awaiting the light of his truth. They, in turn, would listen with polite, unreadable eyes, sometimes offering him their own stories of the earth, the sky, and the spirits that dwelled within them. He dismissed these tales as primitive folklore, the innocent musings of those yet to be enlightened, never truly hearing the profound reverence woven into their every syllable. A growing unease, subtle as the shifting desert sands, began to prick at the edges of his composure. It was not a fear, but a strange, almost imperceptible hum beneath the surface of his ordered world. He would stand at the edge of a canyon, feeling a presence that was not the familiar embrace of his God, but something ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to his carefully constructed doctrines. He attributed it to the sheer scale of the wilderness, the raw power of nature, yet it lingered, a persistent echo in the quiet chambers of his mind. One night, a dream came to him, vivid and unsettling. He stood on a high peak, and the stars above him began to swirl, not in the orderly procession he knew, but in a chaotic, living dance. A great, unseen force moved through the air, a soundless roar that vibrated through his very bones, stripping away the layers of his understanding. He awoke in a cold sweat, the image burned into his mind, and though he prayed for guidance and dismissed it as a mere nightmare, the unsettling feeling persisted, a tiny crack in the foundation of his certainty. He tried to rationalize these feelings, to fit them into the framework of his theology. Perhaps it was the devil testing his resolve, or simply the loneliness of the frontier playing tricks on his mind. He redoubled his prayers, his sermons grew more fervent, his pronouncements on God's justice more absolute. He sought to reinforce the walls of his faith, to keep out the encroaching wilderness of the unknown, to silence the whispers that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath his feet. But the whispers did not cease. They grew louder, more insistent, like a vine slowly, inexorably, wrapping itself around the very heart of his carefully cultivated belief. He felt a subtle, creeping doubt, a foreign seed planted deep within his soul, threatening to sprout and unravel everything he held sacred. The whispers grew, and soon they would demand to be heard. The dry season stretched on, relentless and unforgiving, baking the earth until it cracked like ancient pottery. The preacher preached of divine tests of the Lord's will, urging his congregation to pray for rain, for the mercy of God's justice. He spoke with his usual conviction, but a tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through his voice as the sun beat down day after day, and the well springs of the settlement began to dwindle, mirroring the slow erosion of his own inner certainty. The suffering was palpable, a stark challenge to his pronouncements of a benevolent, intervening God. Then came the dust storm, a monstrous, swirling leviathan that blotted out the sun, turning day into a choking ochre night. It raged for 3 days and 3 nights, tearing at the flimsy structures of the settlement, stripping the land bare. The preacher huddled with his flock, praying, reciting scripture, but his words felt hollow, swallowed by the howling wind. In the heart of the storm, a profound silence descended upon him, a moment of terrifying clarity where his God felt distant, absent, and the raw, indifferent power of the earth consumed everything. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured and reshaped, something else had shifted within the preacher. He walked out into the desolate quiet, and there, etched into the newly exposed rock face of a nearby bluff, was a symbol he had seen before on the hides and pottery of the indigenous people. It pulsed with an unseen energy, not of light, but of pure ancient presence. It was not a sign from his God. It was something else entirely, something that resonated with the very core of the earth, a silent, undeniable appearance. This was Wakan Tanka, not as a deity to be worshipped in a church, but as the living, breathing spirit of everything. It was in the wind that now whispered a different song, in the resilient sagebrush pushing through the dust, in the vast, indifferent sky that seemed to hold both creation and destruction in its silent gaze. It was a presence that bypassed his intellect, his theology, and went straight to the raw, untamed wilderness of his soul. He felt it, not understood it, and the feeling was both terrifying and undeniably real. His initial resistance was fierce, a desperate clinging to the familiar anchors of his faith. He tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as exhaustion, as a trick of the light, as the lingering effects of the storm. He prayed harder, pleaded with his God to reassert his dominion, to banish this unsettling intrusion. But the presence of Wakan Tanka was not something to be banished. It was simply there, an undeniable truth that had always existed, waiting for him to finally open his eyes beyond the narrow confines of his own understanding. The overwhelming nature of this new spiritual force began to dismantle his carefully constructed world. His framework, once so robust, now felt like a fragile cage, unable to contain the boundless, untamed spirit that had revealed itself. The dawning realization was a cold, stark truth. His God, as he knew him, was too small for this vast, living universe. His God was too small, and the universe was about to swallow him whole. The appearance of Wakan Tanka was not a gentle revelation, but a cataclysmic tremor that ripped through the very bedrock of the preacher's soul. It was not a vision to be interpreted, nor a sign to be pondered. It was an undeniable, visceral presence that permeated every fiber of his being, a force so immense and indifferent to his human constructs that it left him breathless and utterly undone. His sermons, once so confident, now felt like hollow echoes in the vast canyon of his newfound spiritual desolation, each word a painful reminder of a faith that was rapidly dissolving. His faith, the very core of his existence, was actively being dismantled, brick by painful brick. The God of his youth, the God of his pulpit, the God of his unwavering justice, began to recede, not into nothingness, but into a distant, human-made construct that could not encompass the boundless living spirit he now perceived. It was a spiritual death, a profound and agonizing loss of the only truth he had ever known, leaving him adrift in an ocean of terrifying, beautiful uncertainty. The emotional and spiritual pain was immense, a raw wound exposed to the elements. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, not from Wakan Tanka, but from the limitations of his own understanding, from the narrow confines of the doctrine he had so fiercely championed. The comfort of certainty was replaced by the dizzying expanse of the unknown, a universe that was far grander, far more interconnected, and infinitely more mysterious than he had ever dared to imagine. Every prayer he uttered now felt like a question, not an affirmation. Yet amidst the terror of this unraveling, there was an undeniable, breathtaking beauty. The wind that had once been merely air now carried the breath of Wakan Tanka. The mountains were not just stone, but ancient, silent sentinels of a living spirit. The very dust beneath his feet was imbued with a sacred presence. It was a beauty that transcended human language, a raw, untamed divinity that existed in every leaf, every stone, every drop of water. A truth that had always been there, waiting for his eyes to be opened. He found himself isolated in this new understanding, unable to articulate the profound shift within him to his congregation, who still clung to the familiar words of his old sermons. How could he explain that the God he had preached was but a single facet of a boundless, interconnected spirit that defied all names and forms? He was a man caught between two worlds, the old one crumbling behind him, the new one stretching out before him, vast and uncharted, leaving him utterly alone in his revelation. The change within him was profound, irreversible. The preacher who had stood so tall, so certain, was gone, replaced by a man humbled, broken, and yet, paradoxically, more whole than he had ever been. His journey had led him not to a new answer, but to a deeper, more profound question. a question that resonated with the very pulse of the earth. His old faith was shattered, and there was no going back. The aftermath of his transformation left the preacher a man profoundly altered, a vessel emptied of old certainties and slowly, painstakingly, refilled with a reverence that defied easy definition, a quiet, almost melancholic awe that settled deep within his bones. His very posture seemed to have softened, the rigid lines of his former conviction replaced by a subtle curve of humility, a willingness to simply be in the presence of something far greater than himself. He still stood before his congregation, the familiar wooden pulpit beneath his hands, worn smooth by years of fervent pronouncements. But his sermons were different now. Less about the rigid dictates of God's justice, and more about the interconnectedness of all things, the sacred breath that moved through the land, the sky, and every living creature. His words, once sharp and declarative, were now softer, imbued with a profound melancholic wisdom, a quiet awe for the boundless mystery he had encountered, a truth that resonated with the very pulse of the earth itself, a silent symphony he was only just beginning to hear. Sometimes he would simply fall silent in the middle of a sermon, his voice trailing off into a thoughtful hush, a moment of profound introspection that would leave the congregation in a bewildered quiet. His gaze would drift towards the open door of the chapel, towards the vast, sun-drenched plains beyond, and his eyes would no longer see mere landscape, but the living spirit of Wakan Tanka, manifest in every detail. He would see it in the effortless, majestic soaring of a hawk against the azure, its shadow a fleeting blessing upon the earth. He would hear it in the distant rumble of thunder echoing across the canyons, a primal voice speaking of power and renewal. He would feel it in the resilient wildflowers pushing through the dry earth, their vibrant colors a testament to life's enduring will against all odds. He no longer sought to define or contain the divine within human-made boundaries, within the pages of a book or the walls of a church. He simply sought to witness it, to be present in its boundless, untamed presence, a quiet observer of a truth too grand for human words, a truth that had always been there, patiently waiting for his awakening. His relationship with the world had shifted irrevocably, a fundamental reorientation of his very being that permeated every aspect of his existence. The land was no longer merely a stage for human endeavor, a backdrop for his ministry, or a resource to be exploited for sustenance and profit. It was a living entity, a sacred text written in stone and sky, in wind and water, each ripple in the stream, each rustle of leaves, each grain of sand, a whispered verse of an ancient, ongoing scripture. He walked with a new humility, his steps lighter upon the earth, as if fearing to disturb the delicate balance of life, his eyes now seeing the intricate, shimmering web of existence that had always been there, unseen by his former, narrower vision. He understood now that he was not separate from this vast tapestry, but an integral, albeit tiny, thread woven within it, a part of something infinitely larger and more profound than any single human life. The melancholic acceptance of his new, less certain, but infinitely more profound faith settled upon him like the evening dust, a gentle, pervasive presence that brought both a quiet ache and a deep, abiding peace. He carried the scars of his spiritual battle, the raw, tender wound of what he had lost, the comfort of his old, familiar God, the absolute certainty that had once defined him, but also the profound peace of what he had found, a peace born of surrender to the vast unknown, a liberation from the confines of dogma. His wisdom was not born of books or doctrines, of theological debates or learned interpretations, but of a direct, terrifying encounter with the boundless, a truth that had stripped him bare and rebuilt him anew, leaving him with a quiet, knowing gaze that saw beyond the surface of things into the very heart of being. He did not abandon his calling entirely, for the deep-seated need to share, to connect, to guide, remained a part of his very essence, though its form had irrevocably changed. His ministry became less about converting souls to a specific creed, less about the rigid adherence to rules, and more about simply being, about sharing the quiet reverence he now held for the living world, for the spirit that permeated all things, for the sacredness inherent in every moment. He was no longer a preacher of doctrine, but a quiet witness to wonder. A man who had walked through the fire of spiritual annihilation and emerged with a different kind of light. A light that flickered with the vastness of the cosmos, not the contained glow of a single candle. A beacon of a truth that transcended human understanding, inviting others not to believe, but to see. His faith was never the same, but what was it now? It was not a destination, a fixed point of arrival, a finished structure of belief, but an endless journey, a continuous unfolding, a quiet, profound communion with the spirit that moved through all things, a reverence for the boundless, untamed mystery of existence itself, a silent prayer breathed into the very fabric of the universe. He had found a God, not in words, not in ancient texts, not in the confines of a man-made temple, but in the wind that whispered secrets, in the earth that cradled all life, in the beating heart of the wild, untamed world, a truth that resonated deeper than any sermon, a truth that was simply is. His faith was never the same, and neither would yours be, if you truly understood the silence between the words, the breath within the wind.